Let's call this meeting of the working group to order. Madam Clerk, would you take the roll of the Senate?
Senator White is present. Senator Powers is present. Senator Hensley is present. Senator Agberry. Chairman Lundberg
Here.
is present. Mr. Chairman, you have 4 Senate members present.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Mr. Clerk, would you take the roll of the House?
Representative Glenn. Representative Hill. Representative Hill is present. Chair Lady Moody.
Here.
Chair Lady Moody is present. Representative Reagan. Representative Slater.
Here.
Representative Slater is present. Chair Lady, you have 3 members present.
Thank you.
Thank you, and welcome members back to this Wednesday morning, and welcome to the audience. As we've said in the other groups, you're welcome to hold signs. We do ask that you not hold them in front of your face or above your head or beside you so that we can keep those behind you, give them a clear view. Any personal orders to come before the body? Seeing none, just a personal order on my behalf. I have last couple of weeks, I think we've gotten a great deal of information, and candidly, I think we've also educated many people across the state of education funding, the federal and statewide. So I think it's been a great learning experience. We wanted to begin this morning with those who kind of kicked us off, and as I introduce you, if you folks want to make your way back up to the table from the Comptroller's office. The Comptroller's office runs the Office of Research and Education Accountability. We had them give us a 50 or 100,000 foot view. That was a perspective I think Chair Lady Moody and I wanted to give the committee kind of the basic overview. Since then, they have been, I've noticed you have attended every meeting we've had. I appreciate that. So you had a couple of questions from members that I think you're going to present back to us today, the answers to those, and fill in some of the gaps and some of the questions we had throughout the last couple of weeks of testimony. And with that, I will turn the floor to you and ask that you, as you begin, if you would, even though I've told the organization if you would introduce yourself, again, you're recognized.
Good morning. I'm Russell Moore, Director of the Comptroller's Office of Research and Education Accountability. With me this morning is Linda Wesson, Assistant Director of the office. And we also have with us Mr. Lance Iverson and Mr. Matthew Veach. They are both research analysts in OREA. We're glad to be with you again this morning regarding federal funding for K-12 education in Tennessee. At the conclusion of our first presentation to you, we outlined action steps for us to support the research needs of this joint working group. One of those steps was to take an inventory of data, presentations, and question and answers for the meetings to follow, those meetings that have now occurred. And this joint working group has indeed been presented with much data and has posed numerous questions and pondered the answers provided. After attending all the subsequent meetings since we last came before you and reviewing the data, the presentations, the questions, the answers, we have prepared the following presentation for the joint working group this morning. We hope each of you will find it useful as you continue to examine this issue. For this morning's presentation, we have a review of federal grant funding, a review of federal grant requirements, a general framework for decision-making about this issue, and also we prepared a memo in response to questions that we said we'd get back to the working group on, and I believe that has been provided to the members this morning. I'll now turn things over to Linda, who is going to present our review of federal grant funding and federal grant requirements.
Good morning. Just wanted to recap some of the different numbers you've heard and where they came from. The $1.81 billion is from the 2023-24 budget. That is the bulk of, those are the funds going to the Department of Education. The bulk of them are passed through to the LEAs. It includes formula grants and non-recurring grants. And so that 1.8 billion is about 20% of the total 8.97 billion in the budget. Excuse me. And I did want to mention that budget number can include carryovers of federal funds from prior fiscal years that the state is ready to spend in the budget year. And just to make it a little more complicated, federal programs do layer some carryover rules on top of the state budget process. For example, Title I, each LEA is allowed to carry over 15% of Title I's they receive. And every 3 years, they can apply for a waiver to carry over more than the automatically approved 15% carryover. And Title I, as it's laid out, has a 27-month spending period. So just wanted to make clear that federal funds, unlike probably the state funds, don't necessarily have to be spent in that fiscal year. The next slide highlights funds that districts receive directly from federal grants, and that's 109 million. So million is a small number, I know, but we have not really delved into that, and we just wanted to point those funds out to you, that those are funds that do not flow through the state. One example is the impact aid, which is federal funds to help serve federally connected children, like think on military bases and such like that. Also, when local areas lose property taxes, if the federal tax-exempt property in their region, the impact aid helps make up those local funds. JROTC reimbursements are another example. And so just to clarify that not all districts receive these direct federal funds. In 2021-22, it was 71 districts, so about half of them. But this small 109 million is in addition to the 2.4 billion federal funds that flow through from the state. So that's the majority. This is just, we just wanted to highlight, because I know there were some questions about that direct federal funds. This is just another look at the 2023 federal education grants allocated to Tennessee. We've labeled the last week, if you recall, we talked about the 5 biggest ones, and those are labeled the food programs, Title I, Title II Perkins, and IDEA. This graph includes that little green sliver at the 12 o'clock position on the graph. Those are the non-recurring grants. Those might be competitive grants like the charter school 15 million program grant that Tennessee received, and some one-time COVID funds, which are kind of declining now, although some of that carryover money, they're still being spent. They're just not in this 2023 allocation. And just one more recap of the formula grant allocations that our office really focused on. The ones at the top half of this table are the ones we've talked about previously. The remaining formula grants on the bottom half of this slide, we've talked about some of these like Title III for English learners, but we just wanted to mention a couple of the others you might not have really locked in on. For example, Title IV-A includes funding for things like safety and health supports for students, which also enrichment classes for well-rounded education outside of the core subjects, and for use of technology in classrooms. Title IV-B is called 21st Century Community Learning Centers. Mostly what that is before and after school programs and some summer programs. So taken together, those smaller formula funds on the bottom half of this table totaled 63 million in federal allocations for the year 2023. Apologies. And then to recap, we've talked a lot about requirements. As you've heard from other presentations, there are a variety of program requirements attached to any of the federal funds. We just wanted to take a more in-depth look at some grant-specific requirements. We selected 2 examples. for this morning. One in the program in the hundreds of millions, which is your Title 1A, and one in the tens of millions, which is Title II. Both are part of ESSA. And we could certainly provide the task force more information for other programs like this as needed. I'm not going to read through all these bullets. We just wanted to give you, again, a sense of the types of requirements going into all these programs. The bottom bullet on this slide, which actually should be two separate bullets, apologies. Some of these requirements are big program requirements, like conduct an annual state assessment in various grade levels, or to establish an accountability system that identifies lowest performing schools. The Title 1A requirements continue, things that are probably just good educational practice, like making sure teachers have met the license requirements, and that the state is monitoring district spending of Title 1A. So those are considered sub-grants from the state grant. The money flows through to the districts, so the state needs to keep accountability on that spending at the local districts, kind of just a good practice thing. And more of requirements for Title I, financial requirements, including maintenance of effort, supplement not supplant, and limits on district, on state administrative funds, which you heard from the department yesterday. And then just to look at a little slightly smaller program, Title II, many of the similar requirements for Title I. Again, at the bottom, you see there's limits on funds that can be used for state administration and state-level activities. Again, most of the funds have to be passed through to the districts. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Russell to talk about a framework for decision-making.
All right. Thank you, Linda. Thank you for that review of federal funds and also of the review of federal requirements. Something else that we've prepared for the working group this morning is a general framework for decision-making about this issue. First up in the framework is the waiver option. This option relates to point 4 listed in the September 22nd letter from the speakers that created this joint working group. Specifically, that the working group should recommend a strategy on how to reject certain federal funding or, quote, how to eliminate unwanted restrictions placed on the state due to the receipt of federal funds, end quote. The option here would be to seek a waiver or waivers from the United States Department of Education and or the United States Department of Agriculture from specific federal requirements. Next up, reject and replace federal funding. If the waiver option is not pursued, or if the waiver option is pursued but results in an unsatisfactory end, then an option would be to proceed with rejecting and replacing federal funding. If the General Assembly decides to proceed along these lines, then there are questions related to the scope of the rejection and replacement, such as how much to reject and replace, and from which federal grant or grant categories. Regarding those grant categories, there are the recurring federal grants that the Joint Working Group has been discussing. For example, a title or titles of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, last reauthorized as ESSA in 2015. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, last reauthorized in 2004. School nutrition through USDA, and Perkins for career and technical education programs. The discussion to date about possibly rejecting and replacing federal grant funds has centered on those recurring grants. One of the main questions has been, as you all will recall, to what extent are these funding sources bundled or separable in any reject and replace scenario? Some mention has also been made of other categories of federal grant dollars for K-12 education, and we have listed that category here, those categories here, in the interest of providing a comprehensive picture of the categories of federal funding for K-12 education. One of these categories is non-recurring federal grants, discretionary grants, competitive grants. Think of the COVID relief funds as one example. Think of competitive grants that Tennessee has pursued in the past, such as the Race to the Top grant. Another category, and Linda mentioned this in her section of the presentation this morning, are those direct-to-district grants. As the working group has heard, most of the federal funding for K-12 education first goes to the state, which then allocates the funding to the local districts and schools. Some of the federal funding, however, goes directly from the federal government to local governments. We've included a slide in today's presentation with data and information about this funding category. That was the slide that Linda covered that was somewhere around $110 million. Timing is another consideration. If the decision is made to reject and replace, when would this occur? Would it be on a date certain? Is a gradual phase-in approach possible, where federal funding would gradually be phased out while the non-federal replacement funding is phased in? An incremental approach is another consideration, and this overlaps with the scope of any possible rejection and replacement. If the state proceeded with some amount of rejection and replacement, then at some point afterward, an assessment of the situation could be made or would be made. And at that point, decisions about next steps could be made. Whether to continue with the rejection and replacement and possibly expand the scope, whether to halt the effort and maintain things as they are at that time going forward, or whether to possibly reverse the rejection and replacement effort. One more observation about timing, too, and this relates to continued monitoring of changes at the federal level, to funding levels, to thresholds, eligibility for programs, etc. The precise amount of federal funding for a given category will obviously vary each year, but it can also vary based on changes made at the federal level to eligibility thresholds and the resulting response from state and local governments. Next, requirements, eligibility, and benefits. Given the presentations and discussions over the past 2 weeks, a detailed crosswalk of federal requirements versus state requirements for whatever federal grant funding categories are being considered for rejection and replacement may be in order. In making this comparison, distinctions could be made among law set by the General Assembly, rules and regulations set by, for example, the Tennessee State Board of Education, and policies set by the Tennessee State Board of Education and/or the Tennessee Department of Education. Other possible categories for any crosswalk could include state requirements that mirror federal requirements. In other words, these are state requirements that were put in place to comply with federal requirements. State requirements that go beyond federal requirements. These would be state requirements that go beyond the minimum required by the federal government. And also state requirements that predated any related federal requirements might also be of interest, including when those requirements were put into place and for what reason or reasons. Eligibility and benefits are another consideration. And one of the key questions here, whether to maintain those currently in place under federal funding or make adjustments to those in any reject and replace scenario. Incrementalism is present here too, as the General Assembly could, for example, decide to keep eligibility and benefits the same initially and then possibly make changes to eligibility or benefits at a later time. I would also add the level of decision-making is another aspect of this. What would be required by the state, whether that's required through law or rules and regulations or policies, and what would be left up to local governments to decide? How much local autonomy would there be under a reject and replace scenario? And as is the case currently regarding local autonomy, locals might apply to the state for waivers from certain state requirements. The generation and distribution of replacement funding is another aspect to consider. Some of the questions here are whether the replacement funding might be folded into the state's new K-12 funding formula, TISA, or would it be done separately? Whether there would be a state-local split with some or all of the replacement funding, or whether it might be 100% state funding. TISA provides an example of the state-local split with the base and weighted funding, which overall is 70% state dollars and 30% local dollars. TISA also provides an example of 100% state funding, as the direct funding component and the outcomes funding component are both 100% state funded. As for distribution to local governments, would the same formulas and methods currently used with federal dollars be used in a reject and replace scenario? Again, the General Assembly could maintain the current formulas and methods initially and then possibly make changes at a later time. And yesterday we heard of various set-aside requirements that are part of certain categories of federal funding, limits on administrative spending and expenses, and Linda referenced those in her portion of the presentation. So that's another consideration along these lines. Other fiscal considerations include the sustainability of the funding sources used to replace federal funding, reaction of the bond rating agencies, the current state of any carryover federal funding for K-12 education, and the state's timeline for spending those dollars. And again, Linda referenced that in her portion of the presentation. And also assessing the shift from federal to non-federal sources relative to existing and future contracts. Reactions from other parties are a factor. The reaction of the United States Department of Education and or the United States Department of Agriculture, depending on the federal grants considered, and the scope and the timing of any rejection and replacement effort. Potential litigation is another consideration and one that has been raised by presenters. A possible related step here might be to request an opinion or opinions, if not already done, from the Tennessee Attorney General and reporter about various legal aspects of this issue. There are obviously other questions about this effort. It's a complex issue, and this is not an exhaustive list of the questions or the complexities or the decision-making points. Our hope, though, is that this will be a useful general framework for your future work on this issue. And finally, as stated during our presentation last week, we stand ready to provide further research assistance to the working group as requested. Thank you.
Russell, thank you. Let's see if we have some follow-up questions from the committee. Questions from the committee. Senator Hensley, you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for the presentation. And I just had one question. Yesterday, when we were hearing from the department, they gave a figure of about $480 million for nutrition, and y'all had a figure of 270 million or 280 million or something. It seems like a big difference. And that's one issue. We've heard different amounts of how much the federal government really gives us. They said about 1.3 billion yesterday from the department, and then the figure y'all gave, but that was quite a difference between nutrition. So I'm just wondering how y'all came up with the figure and then how they did.
I don't recall from yesterday which year they were taking it from. I believe they might have been taking, they were reporting 2024 federal allocations. So ours are 2023, and
Well,
I don't know.
Theirs was 2023.
Okay.
And they had nutrition 474 million, and then 4 million for expense funds, 5 million fruit and vegetables. So that was a total of 484 million, and they say that was fiscal year 23.
Okay, we'll definitely have to check into that. I don't know what, because we pulled these numbers from figures that we got from the department, so I'm not
Okay,
sure
well,
where
that's
the
just
disconnect.
figures
Yeah.
that they gave us yesterday, so I don't know what that's $200 million difference in 1 year. But, and then another question is, of these federal requirements, do you have a list or any way we could find out what federal requirements we could forego if we did not take the money? Some of these state requirements and federal requirements, do you know what federal requirements are required, or which ones maybe we could do away with if we didn't? Because that's a whole issue we're trying to face is what strings or what requirements that we could forego if we didn't take the money. So I saw y'all listed some of those, but which ones, or do you know, or is that something we would have to determine?
I think that's something that would have to be determined. I think it's probably relates to that framework of if the state pursued a waiver with USDOE or USDA, the state would be asking for a waiver, asking for an exception from specific requirements. So the state would have identified what those requirements are that they're seeking an exception for. Under a reject and replace scenario, I think that relates to that crosswalk that I mentioned in the general framework section of the presentation, which would be to compare the federal requirements with state requirements and essentially decide what to leave in or what to take out if the state pursued a reject and replace scenario.
So you're saying that we wouldn't really know those requirements until we had the waiver and see exactly what the waiver entailed? There's really no way for us to just look at the requirements we have now that are tied to the federal funds and just say which ones of those we wouldn't have to do?
Well, I think that's probably something that the executive branch, the Tennessee Department of Education, for example, along with the legislature, would have to confer. In a waiver scenario, you know, the state would be asking for an exception from specific requirements. So even though it's required, it would be a decision for the federal government to make as to whether or not to grant that waiver in whole or in part. With the reject and replace scenario, at least for the specific, depending on the grant that was chosen, the specific requirements for that grant, I think there would be likely more decision-making by the state as to which ones to keep or maintain by the state, for the state and also for local governments. Does that help? It's
Somewhat, yes.
Yeah,
It's still-
somewhat,
it's
yeah,
still
yeah.
up in the
Yeah.
air about which ones, and then one
Yeah.
other question. We heard yesterday that the federal funding is outside of the TISA funding. It's
Yeah.
on top of the TISA funding.
right.
So I just always assumed the federal funding was rolled into that TISA funding, and that was
Yeah.
part of the additives to the base formula for especially for the disability, different tiers of those, but that's all, but that's passed through the state, and that goes to each school system according to grants, correct?
Right, most of it does go through the state and then goes out to local school districts. But I will add, I can see TISA is separate from the federal funding. And
Right.
and what you heard yesterday about federal funding being a supplement to the state and local dollars that go through TISA, yeah, that's correct. But I can see maybe why you've had that thought here and there, because there are aspects of TISA that use federal formula, like for instance, Title I schools.
Right.
Like TISA would use that to say, okay, this is how much we're going to send in weighted funding to certain schools that meet that designation or have certain students that are in, say, concentrated poverty. So the dollars, yes, the dollars are separate. The federal dollars are a supplement to the state and local dollars through TISA. TISA, as the BP did, the former K-12 funding formula, uses some of those federal formula methods to identify the schools and districts that will receive, the state and local, a portion of the state and local dollars through TISA. Does that make sense?
Yes, but those Title I funds, they go to the low-income students and schools, so they are apportioned to the schools according to how many students are in that Title I school?
I believe so. There's 4 different formulas for Title I. If you want to hear more details, Matthew could probably delve into it, but basically, it's the proportion of low-income students they have in their schools.
Okay, and the schools are getting a extra percentage for the low-income students as well through TISA.
Right,
And then they're getting federal money on top of that for each one of those students.
correct.
That's correct.
And I did, Lance has found the answer to your question about the food funds being different from what TDOE reported. So I'm going to let him give you a short answer on that.
Okay,
Well, potential answer. When we had been presented to the task force has been the allocations of federal funds that the federal government has communicated to Tennessee, and that has been information that members have been exposed to for some period of time. What was presented yesterday as the Department of Education just went through their budget development process. I believe they actually had their budget request with the governor yesterday, was fiscal year 23 and then 24 budgeted funds for both of those. In 23, there was potential that some of that could have been carryover of previously unspent funds, but then also I want to emphasize that their information is that presented yesterday could have been the most recent information and correspondence that they've received from the federal government, as we've been using information that had existed from several months ago. So hopefully that provides some additional clarity on what was presented yesterday as by the Department of Education as some of the most recent information that the state of Tennessee has received from the federal government.
but still not very clear to me, but it's about clear as mud, but that's, so is there that much difference in the other funds too, the IDA funds and the Title I funds? Because that was about twice what y'all's figure was, what they had. So you're saying their figure is the 24 budget, the $480 million?
There could be the difference, as we talked about at the beginning about carryover funds.
Right.
So what the federal allocation comes each year, which can be spent, like Title I funds can be spent over 2 years, but then the state, actually in the governor's budget, the state budgets what they think they're actually going to spend, which could be some of the current year and some of a previous year, part of that 2-year spending period plus carryover funds. So I would not have guessed that it was that much, but I am not the federal expert, and TDOE or FNA could probably give you a lot better detail, but that's where we think the difference is they're using actual budgeted funds, which include some of past year federal funding, because the state budget is what the state's predicting for this year, as opposed to we were using federal funds that are announced each year. Yes, I know, clear as mud, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay,
And-
well, it just seems like a lot of times up here, we see figures for different budgets and then learn later on that money wasn't spent, or it's still there, or it's spent in the next year, but that's just a big difference, $200 million. But anyway, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And I will say, Senator Hensley, we'll confer with the Tennessee Department of Education on those big buckets and explain our number and the year and any presence of carryover funds or the reason for the difference between those. we'll explain those and we'll get that to the working group.
Thank you. Adding on to Senator Hensley, I don't know if it's germane to the committee, but I have the same kind of surprise, I think, that Senator Hensley did, which is when we did TISA, and we added obviously weights in there, weights that were determined by low income, by geographic distance from a school, and those things, and added funds in for that, or dyslexia. And to find out that those federal funds are not part of that equation does surprise me, because that's in the hundreds of millions of dollars that I anticipated would be utilized in there on an ongoing, recurring basis. I think here, and switching gears, it was just an aside, I think your second slide, when it talked about, for example, Title I, and that slide, I get the sense that federal government is giving us broad discretion. So we want you, for example, to be associated with NAEP, but they're not going into detail of the other bullets you have. It's up to us to talk about how we're going to deal with it in Tennessee, as opposed to if we were in Montana, Illinois, or wherever, they'd have literally 50 different states. So we could, if we were going to do anything to opt out or seek a waiver, it would be our discretion within those various lines of the bucket, if that makes sense. Is that correct?
That does make sense, and I think that goes back to that crosswalk again of what's required by the federal government and how do we meet that requirement. Is it in law? Is it in rule and regulation? Is it in policy? And what requirements do we have at the state level or local level that are set just by the state? So it's kind of two things. It's how do we comply with the federal requirement, and what is the judgment about that? But then also, what has the state decided to require that isn't necessarily required by the federal government? And I would just add to Chairman Lundberg on the TISA and federal funding being a supplement to that. From the perspective, I believe, of the district and the school, those monies are flowing in to assist those particular students. So let's say a disabled student or a student with disabilities, they would receive, the base funding through TISA, the weighted funding through TISA, and then they would also be receiving some of that federal IDEA money. And the district and the school would use that to support that particular disabled student with disabilities.
Yep.
Just point of clarification on that.
Got it. On the first part of your answer in that discussion, some of those federal requirements, are those requirements that are done by statute or by rule? Federally?
Yeah, that's that's the crosswalk idea that we put out there.
Right.
Is I don't think we have that right now. Is kind of I don't know if it's a document or whatever, but this side by side, here's what the federal government requires, and here's how Tennessee meets that requirement, whether it's through law, through rule, regulation, or policy, and then separately, here's what the state requires. This is what the state has decided to require on its own. And, if we were to approach the reject and replace effort, to me, all of those things are, they start to become kind of open for discussion. Not only what federal requirements would we possibly want to get out from under, but also what are the state requirements, and what's the opinion of the General Assembly about those in addition to the federal requirements, if that makes sense. It's sort of like when we open up the box of requirements, we're looking at federal requirements and how the state complies with those, but then there are likely to be some state requirements that are in place that the federal government does not require, and what is our thinking about that?
And I understand, generally, Senator Hensley, again, it is muddy. I guess I'm looking for, is that more by statute or by rule, both on the federal or the state government?
Well, in the state government, that's the idea of having, essentially there's work to be done on that, I guess is the bottom line on that, is we haven't seen, if it's been done, we haven't seen this crosswalk, as I call it, where let's take one of the titles. I'll take Title II just because that was brought up as one of our examples. What does the federal government require for Title II? How does the state comply with those requirements? Did we put it in law? Is it done more through rules and regulations? Is it done more through policies? And then on the subject of supporting effective instruction, that's what Title II concerns. What does the state require that the federal government does not require? Because those things are all, in my mind, kind of open for discussion if we're looking at requirements in general, federal, state, and so on. So again, to sort of underscore this, that work, I don't know that that work has been done to see the overlap or, you know, sort of the Venn diagram, like how much of the state requirements are federal, we did those because of federal requirements, how much of them is a decision that Tennessee made apart from the federal government. The federal government did not require it, we decided to require it. So it's work to be done is again, kind of my bottom line. I'm not aware that this document exists, but if it did, we would have a better sense of how we bring the federal requirements to life in the state and what things we require that the federal government does not require in these areas.
So I'm taking it that you're taking that as a challenge and a task for ORIA to
They're different.
compile.
It's work to be done.
So-
The final slide is to continue to provide research assistance to this working group as requested.
This is a solid line. I think we all are kind of curious specifically on that and by statute, by rule, both at the federal government level and at the state government level. I think that's really important to our conversations.
And I would add to that that would be a big undertaking.
It would
Yeah.
be indeed. So Representative Reagan, you recognize, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a series of questions. Let's start with the letter that you gave us to answer questions that were previously done. In your first paragraph, you cite a 2019 study where you outline various waste by category. That looks to be very exemplary, but the question is this a one-time effort, or is there anything ongoing with that?
I'm not aware of any ongoing study.
So there is no capability then for us to say, this is an average and these are the standard deviations and this is the variation that goes between it? So that without an ongoing study, that's impossible?
I don't believe they did. I think they did that after some new nutrition standards went into effect about 10 years ago. I think there were some concerns about the effect of those new nutrition standards on school food authorities and the school nutrition programs. So this portion of the study on food waste, it was one part of a multiple part, fairly sizable study that USDA contracted out to have done. And so we haven't seen that they've updated that, and that was taken in 2015. We looked to see if any of the schools, and you see listed there 165 schools where the observers observed lunch trays, and some 154 schools for breakfast trays. We looked to see, we tried to find out whether or not any of those schools were Tennessee schools. But they didn't have that level of detail about their methodology. So that was the best information we could find on food waste specifically being studied. It was a national study. It was from 2015, but it does give you a sense, at least at that time, based on that sample that Mathematica Policy Research conducted, the scope of it and the characteristics of it.
So to summarize, we still do not have a Tennessee-specific figure.
We're not aware of a Tennessee-specific figure. I believe there was some reference to Anderson County yesterday, but we looked for Tennessee-specific, this type of study in Tennessee, and so far we haven't found anything on that.
Thank you. That does drive another question, though. If Tennessee we in the General Assembly wanted to see this information, would we have to ask for a waiver from the USDA to be able to conduct a study and to be able to perhaps overlay a process improvement effort on that?
That's probably a question for the school nutrition individuals at the Tennessee Department of Education. I believe Shannon Gordon, I believe that was her name, that was up here yesterday. I don't know the answer to your question as to whether or not a waiver would be necessary to do something like that. I tend to think, to study food waste, you would not need a waiver to do that. But it's probably best to consult, or we can find out from her for you, as to whether or not a waiver would be necessary to study it.
Thank you. Well, if no waiver is required, then I presume that we would have to generate legislation requesting that study, which would, of course, have a fiscal note on it. And I presume also we would have to contract with, say, University of Tennessee or some other university in our state to conduct that. Is that a valid assumption?
Again, I think that conferring with TDOE on what would be involved in that type of study would probably help answer those questions. I don't know that if legislation would be needed or not. Given what we heard about Anderson County, perhaps there is capacity to undertake something like that. But again, I think that's, we don't have that kind of finely detailed understanding of the school food authorities and their ability to conduct this type of study. I know with the Mathematica study, that was national, so I can understand how the federal government would contract with Mathematica to look at it across the nation. Looking within Tennessee, I think, again, the question's for Department of Education.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, if I might continue. In the same letter we're talking about here, and this is for the sake of the record, the question was asked on the record about definition of migrant children. You have included that. Would you please put that out verbally or orally, please, for our audience?
The term migratory child, and I believe this was part of the Title I, Part C federal grant, means a child or youth who made a qualifying move in the preceding 36 months as a migratory agricultural worker or a migratory fisher, or with or to join a parent or spouse who's a migratory agricultural worker or migratory fisher. And a qualifying move is one due to economic necessity from one residence to another, from one school district to another. And migratory agricultural workers and fishers are what you would typically think of in working in agriculture, dairy work, et cetera, moving for jobs to jobs.
Thank you for clarifying that. I do want some further clarification on slide 10 of your presentation, which is talking about examples of grant-specific requirements, and in particular, concentrating on the cost issues that are pass-throughs. The state may set aside up to 5% of the grant for state-level activities, 1% for state administration, 2% for preparation academies. At least 95% of the grant must pass through to the districts. The question that arises from that is, how much is left that is unfunded that either state or locals must pony up the money to be able to adequately administer and monitor these things? Do we have a figure on that?
No, we do not.
So-
As far as I know, there is, the department, my understanding from their presentation yesterday is they can pull district figures on what's actually been spent for administration and then back it out from there. And at the state level, I'm assuming they could do the same thing. But we don't have data on what you can set aside for administration versus what it actually costs for administration, which I think is what you're...
You're absolutely correct. They talked about FTEs yesterday, old schools as manpower equivalents, but nonetheless, the issue that is before us is we are authorized by the federal government to take so much of the grant to cover administration. But the real question is, how much are we as Tennesseans paying in addition to that to meet these requirements, unfunded mandates? And while we're talking about it, this was just Title II. The other issues before us are the other funding issues and any unfunded mandates that are laid upon us, and we have to comply with to be able to continue these grants. We have no idea what those are, is that correct?
I believe, I don't personally, our office, but I believe some of what TDOE was presenting yesterday was that for at least some of those administrative costs, they were less than what the set-aside was. So that's my understanding, that it's not necessarily more state monies going into it, is that we're doing it for less than what is allowed to be allocated for administration. But I don't have the specific numbers, but it looked like TDOE had pulled those out, at least at the district level, for you all yesterday.
Well, again, there was a little lack of clarity, which I tried to get squared away and failed. That there are programs, for example, Title X, which requires the state and higher educations to have a Title X coordinator. But I have found no monies that come from the federal government to pay for that. So am I correct on that? Is that coming out of our state expenditures?
I don't have any information about that specific title. No, I don't know.
Well, that is just an example. I think there's
Okay.
some other titles that may have similar issues. You also mentioned in your presentation here about the grants. You mentioned the DOD, mentioning the ROTC programs and energy programs, which I assume come through the Department of Energy. And the question that was asked yesterday, and initially of you as well when you were before us, was the cafeteria approach, being able to pick and choose. And if we chose, for example, to leave our funding for the school nutrition untouched, but we wanted to forego funding in another area, would it be impacting those that are not part of that? So do we have an answer on that still?
We do not. I believe that type of question is a question for legal counsel. And that is why maybe we're not getting answers, because I think none of us are lawyers. But those questions about what being able to pick and choose, and can we do this and not that, since, as I think has been mentioned in previous presentations, y'all are exploring new territory. Nobody has direct knowledge of that. I think in our framework, Russell mentioned perhaps getting an Attorney General's opinion. That might be a starting point. But I do not know.
If I might continue then, you mentioned that one avenue that we could pursue is asking for waivers. However, you also mentioned that there are direct grants to the districts. Do the districts have the ability to ask for waivers, or must that be done through the state?
I don't know.
We'll have to research that. Again, these questions that are being asked, we're going to prepare a follow-up memo to the working group.
All right, if I could shift gears a little bit here on the English language learning. You've provided us with the question that I asked about the English Language Institute at UT. And again, a little bit of confusion here. One of the reasons I asked that question is because it's offered to individuals over 16 years and older, and it says in the Knoxville area. So the question arises, what's the rest of the state doing?
My understanding is that from the English Language Institute is that they are a local program serving people locally. The Title III federal funds is for statewide in the classroom instruction of students who are learning English as a second language. So this UT English Language Institute is not involved in instruction for students in classrooms. They deal with individual people, is my best understanding.
My understanding of this UT Language Institute, when we were having our discussion on funding this, was that they were going to provide these services statewide, not just locally. The idea of providing translators for courts and translators for official documents and so forth, as well as perhaps in some educational environments. Am I incorrect in that?
The Tennessee Language Center, which used to be called the Tennessee Foreign Language Institute, is different than the UT Language Institute. It's very confusing with the names. But the Tennessee Language Center, we have a couple of calls into them. I have not heard back from them to confirm. But my understanding is they do provide things like translation services and so forth, but they're not providing K-12 instruction. That's not what their work is.
Okay, let me tidy up my questions for now then, please. On the replace and reject, you mentioned incrementalism as a possibility.
Right.
I wasn't quite clear if we were to decide to try incrementalism. Would that involve requesting a waiver or something else? Please clarify that for me.
Well, you could apply that to the waiver process, but the incrementalism points that I made in the framework were, if the state decided not to pursue a waiver, or if the state pursued a waiver, but it came to an unsatisfactory end in the view of the General Assembly, then the reject and replace option could be pursued. And the general point there about incrementalism is taking steps, as opposed to doing it all at one time. That's just an option, just a general way of thinking about it is, would you pursue an incremental approach where you made a step and then assessed to see whether or not you wanted to continue? Perhaps that's as far as the state would want to go. You would reject and replace step one, assess the context, the circumstances, and then sort of hold the line at that point and not go any further. Or, depending on how things turned out, the state might want to expand that, might want to go further. Or, on the other hand, the state might decide to reverse course and to move away from rejecting and replacing back to what we have now. That's just a general point more than a specific plan.
Okay, if I might, Mr. Chair, one that was intended to be my last question, but I need
That's fine.
need some clarity. The issue with the crosswalk that you keep mentioning.
Yes. Yes.
If we go the incremental route, that crosswalk is going to become extremely more important in terms of what criteria. You mentioned the term you used was mirroring, and I know from the Government Operations Committee that many of our rules and regulations that come before us for approval from the State School Board, Department of Education area, are in fact doing exactly what you said. They are presenting to us, we have to change this to avoid losing money, not because of any state legislation that's directed that. So this crosswalk piece, you would say, would have to include that, as well as those things that we have passed as state laws to do that. But if we do that incrementally, is there a way to assess that impact?
I think the crosswalk, the idea there is to do that before the incrementalism is something that could be done if the state decided to go down the road of rejecting and replacing. Before going down the road of rejecting and replacing, that crosswalk might be done just to get a sense of what, essentially what we would be rejecting in terms of requirements. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. That does drive the question that the good chairman asked earlier. Would your organization be the one to put that together, or do we need to contract with some organization to do that in lieu of your?
I don't know the answer to that, but we're here to assist the working group as needed. I think there are multiple stakeholders, including obviously the Tennessee Department of Education, the State Board of Education. Those immediately come to mind. If the working group or the General Assembly was looking at IDEA Part C, then that would bring in the Department of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. So those are the executive branch agencies with the kind of detailed knowledge of especially the rules and regulations and policies. So I could see us being part of that, but I tend to think it would be a broader sources of input.
Who would be in charge? Getting that, who's going to be the head dog?
We're at the will of the committee, I guess, is what I would say to that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Representative Slater, you're recognized, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Just one, I think just one quick question. So in all the testimony, I don't think that we've heard that Tennessee has ever requested a waiver. Is that a correct statement, or do you know?
No, we have requested multiple waivers. There's actually, it's a public website on one of the federal pages, and you can just see all the lists of waivers. Most of Tennessee's waivers have had to do with assessments. When our first experience with online assessment crashed, we had to get a waiver to say we're not going to submit assessments this year. How caps on students that need special assessment accommodations because of significant disabilities. I believe we've requested waivers on that. There's multiple things. Most, I believe Austin Reed from NCSL mentioned most states, most of the waiver requests usually have to do with assessments. I believe there's also been several waivers about COVID funds because they came very fast, and then how to spend them and requirements, and I'm not familiar with that, but we could certainly get more information. But yes, Tennessee has requested multiple waivers and received many of those, not all.
So that, Mr. Chairman, then does lead to another question. Then it sounded like if we request waivers, or if we were to request waivers, that would help us with understanding what the requirements were. And if we've requested multiple waivers, has that not generated then a list of these requirements, accountability, transparency, those types of things?
I guess I'll look at the waiver as what are first identifying the specific requirements, the specific federal requirements that the state would want relief from.
So that continues to lead to questions. I apologize, Mr. Chairman. Yeah. So maybe I may be misunderstanding, but it sounded like what I was hearing is that waivers would lead to a list of requirements. We've requested multiple waivers. Where's this list of requirements? I think that at least for me on the committee, that's what I'm looking for, is what is it that the federal government is requiring as it relates to the funding. And where is this list? And you mentioned a public website.
Yeah, just to clarify, I think the waiver request, like what the Department of Education would submit, is to say, federal government, you have this specific requirement. We would like to waive it for this year. I mean, they're not for forever. They're a very specific requirement for a very specific reason and why that would benefit student education in Tennessee. It doesn't generate, when I said there's a list of waiver requests from the different states and what those were for. But I think combing through laws and the Code of Federal Regulations and policy lists from the U.S. Department of Education is where you get your list of requirements. That wouldn't generate from a waiver request is for a very limited, specific thing that you're requesting, and they say yes or no.
Okay, and so that sounds like the work that needs to be done. Is that correct? I mean, that work to be done is to comb through those federal requirements, which apparently has not been done by Tennessee, or even, I suppose, even any other state, since this is kind of blazing a new trail, so to speak.
I believe the Department of Education has put together a list in a document that we saw that they put out in February. I don't know how complete and exhaustive it is. So I think some of it is the detail you want, perhaps. So there's a requirement in law for state assessments to happen in these subjects in these grades every year. But then there are federal regulations that get more specific about how those have to be constructed and how they have to be reported and how the scores you need to involve stakeholders and parents, engagement. There's more detailed. And then the policies have even more detail. So I think when there are lists of legal requirements, you can go through the law, and I think you've heard sort of the main requirements from all the different presenters we've gone through. But if there's specific things, the devil's in the details, so if there's specific things kind of further down, I'm not sure that there's necessarily a comprehensive list of all the detailed requirements and guidance and things you have to follow for state assessments is one requirement in Title 1A. So you think all the different titles and all the different sections have similar levels. It's what you want to drill down to get how specific a requirement. We're fine with doing state assessments. Tennessee does more state assessments than the federal government requires, actually. But there might be details within a particular type of assessment and how it's done and how it's reported, or more detail that possibly more work would need to be done if there's specific things farther down in the details that the state would like to get replaced.
Yeah, and I would add to that too that if the state were to choose to reject and replace some portion of federal funding, then the state would be in the driver's seat for what the requirements would be in that area. And so knowing what the federal government required versus what the state requires in whatever shape or form it takes, law, rules and regulation policy, would then be a decision, okay, the state is now picking up the tab, or the state and the locals are now picking up the tab. How many of those federal requirements would we want to maintain in some way, shape, or form in law, rule and regulation policy? How many of those would we not want? And what of the state requirements are there any of those we would want to adjust based on this new trail that we've gone down? That's the core of the reason we included some of those ideas in this presentation. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. On Representative Slater's questions, and because you used assessments as an example, and I look at Title 1A and from a fairly broad perspective from the federal government saying you have to have an accountability measure, and frankly, the level of detail comes from the state of how we're going to comply with that, not the other way around. Am I mistaken in that?
No, I believe that's correct. The federal government's looking for general things, like one of the federal requirements is you have to identify the 5% lowest performing schools.
Right.
But then how you get there and how you do it
Is determined by
up
the
to
state.
the states, yes.
Okay, thank you. So, other questions from the committee? Thank you very much. I appreciate it. So, and if you want to, before you launch into, go back to the comptroller and say, we have a huge task before us. We don't want to send you off quite yet, so stand by for that. So, but we appreciate you and the comptroller's office for the support, not just for this task force, but candidly from the Education Committee, and I speak both for the House and the Senate.
Thank you.
You all have been exemplary, always have been, and we thank you. So,
Thank you.
for the committee, we will be back this afternoon at 1 o'clock. We had planned to make the comptroller both our bookends, so both at the beginning and ending, but we have some other presentations that our House colleagues wanted to bring on this afternoon. Anything else before we go to recess? Seeing none, we stand in recess.